Hey adapters, I'm Doug Parsons. I'm a partner at Simpatico Studios, where we live stream conversations about complex business and social challenges with professionals like yourself who are working on the same issues. Our shows are live streamed in front of a global audience of your professional peers on simpatico.tv. I'm building a new type of online community for professionals like yourself on the Climate Adaptation channel. If you're a regular listener of my America Adapts podcast, I think you'll find that we're taking our conversations about important problems, policies, and solutions to the next level here. And if you're interested in being a guest, we'd love to hear from you. And now join us for this latest episode. Hey adapters, today our guest is Dr. Eric Hittinger. Eric is an associate professor in public policy at the Rochester Institute of Technology, but currently working with L2EP at the University of Lille. His background includes electricity system policy, operation, and economics, with a focus on understanding the benefits and limitations of emerging energy technologies. Solar and wind energy are popular and affordable tools for decarbonization, but they have an economic and technical problem. Eric will discuss the opportunities, limitations, and challenges of using grid flexibility as a solution to this problem. Hi, Eric. Welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. Great to be here.
All right. So you're streaming in someplace really cool. So could you tell us where you're streaming in from, but also what's COVID doing, I guess, for your work there? We're checking in with folks on that.
Yeah, so I'm actually doing a sabbatical year, a sabbatical year and a half in France. So I'm working with a research group here that looks at electric vehicles, doing some work relating to electric vehicle integration and onto the grid and how you manage the grid and the vehicles and coordinate that. As far as COVID goes, it was a pretty tough confinement period. We were stuck inside. Everyone in France was for a few months, but as people probably know from the news, France and most of Europe are pretty calmed down now as far as the virus goes. It's not circulating very strongly. So as far as regular life goes, I'm in the office now. You can take the metro. You have to wear a mask in a lot of different places, but restaurants are open and life is sort of moving forward.
Well, France without cafes is just not France, right?
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to be talking about solar, wind energy. And I guess what I wanted to start is just, what's sort of the status of those energy sources? And we're going to kind of dig into using those. But overall, and I'm not sure if you want to focus more on the domestic market, but what's going on there?
Yeah. So I'd say people who are streaming this talk probably already know this, but I'd say the biggest thing to know, the most important thing to know, is that wind and solar are falling in price really quickly and becoming these very valuable electricity system assets. So I haven't been a professor for that long, but when I started as a professor, I told students that solar energy was just about the most expensive source of electricity that you could add to the grid. So this was 10 years ago, that if you wanted to put solar on the grid, it was pricey. It was more expensive than just about anything else you could add. Today, I get to tell students that solar energy is just about the cheapest source of electricity you can put onto the grid. So that's great. And wind wasn't quite as expensive as solar was 10 years ago, and it's not quite as cheap on average as solar is today. And of course, both of those depend on where you're putting them. But the starting point of the story, the thing to be excited about is that the low cost today means that we have a lot of potential to put a lot of wind and solar onto the grid. So there's the good news.
And the bad news?
Well, so the bad news, the complication, and this isn't anything new to people who've studied solar and wind, is the variability, right? That as people know, it's not news to anyone inside or outside the industry that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And so there becomes a sort of a challenge once you want to put significant amounts of wind and solar onto the grid. So 10 years ago, we were talking about what would it take to put a couple % of wind and solar onto the grid. Now we're talking about, okay, let's talk about putting getting 30 or 40 or 50% of our energy, our electricity from solar and wind. And then also planning out getting to 80, 90% or more and see how that is possible. But you have to overcome this problem of variability. What do you do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? And there's different ways to look at this. One of them is in terms of what might be called a value problem. So if you look at California, they have a thing called the duck curve in California, which is starting now to bite a little bit. And the duck curve is basically this. If you look at demand for electricity over the day, it comes up in the morning, it has kind of an afternoon plateau, and then it goes up in the evening. Peak time for electricity is usually when everyone gets home from work, 5, 6, 7 p.m. If you add a lot of solar to that electricity grid, what you get is something that's sort of the shape of a duck. It goes down in the middle as you produce all of this solar energy. And so the challenge here is a technical one, right? That you need to ramp everything up in the morning and then down and then back up. And the other part of the challenge is an economic one for solar, that if all the solar comes on in the afternoon, the price of electricity in the afternoon will drop. That means that solar producers aren't making a lot of money. So we need a solution for this, because eventually you'll be making no money as a solar producer.
Okay, can you clarify something though? When you think of the cost of solar, you're mainly talking about like getting that solar energy on the grid, but then there's the issue of actual solar installation, and that too has dropped dramatically, right? There's parallels there, but in some ways those are two different costs that you have to factor in.
Yeah, well, so one way to think of this is sort of that there's kind of a race going on. That on the one hand is the cost of a solar installation. If you want to build a solar power plant, a solar farm, the cost of doing that has come down a lot and will continue to come down, right? We're not finished with those costs coming down. And on the other side, though, there's a question of the value of that solar or how much you can sell it for. So if you're a solar developer, you want to build a big solar farm, you have to sell it to somebody. And what they are going to pay for it, it probably has something to do with what they think that it would cost them to get that energy from another source, which has to do with, the prices in the electricity markets. So if the price of electricity is always low in the afternoon because there's a ton of solar on your electricity grid, it's going to be hard to sell more solar for a high price if it's going to show up at that same time, that same afternoon time when the electricity is really cheap. So there's sort of this, I don't want to call it a race to the bottom because that kind of has a negative connotation, but it's a sort of race to low cost, low cost versus low value.
And I think you just described a lot of this, but the actual term of revenue degradation, could you just really kind of define that? What is that?
Yeah, revenue degradation. So there's there's a lot of terms. If you want the more aggressive term, it's sometimes called revenue cannibalization.
Well,
right?
That's better.
Yeah, it's more flashy. But the idea in either case is that, it's solar in California is a perfect example. As you add more solar in California, it brings down the price when solar produces because you have all this energy being produced in the afternoon on sunny days. In the afternoon, you make all this nice solar electricity. And because of supply and demand, when you produce a ton of solar, a lot of other things will go offline. The price will drop because we have this extra supply. And basically, the idea is that if you look at it from a system perspective, as you add more solar, the revenue to a new solar power plant, actually to all solar power plants, including the old ones, will decline, will degrade. So hence the revenue degradation term.
All right. So this notion of, you have a clustering of all the solar energy coming on at the same time makes the energy harder to sell. And so we have to talk about, storage, solar storage. What's the state of that? And it's not great, but I guess we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, so I think storage. So I study storage as probably my main topic of research. Obviously this relates a lot to renewables, and I may be a little biased, but I think that energy storage is probably the most exciting thing to keep your eye on into the future for electricity systems. That storage led primarily by lithium-ion batteries these days, but a lot of other technologies are being developed and have potential, to come in, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and be a later solution. But storage is also coming down in cost. It's actually coming down in cost even faster than solar is. And so what we're seeing is more and more use of storage in places where it makes the most economic sense. One of those places that we're starting to see now is as a solution, in a sense, to this revenue degradation problem. So 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it would be pretty rare to see a solar power plant that was put in that had storage placed with it on location. But these days, this is becoming increasingly common. And the way the storage operates is with solar, it's more straightforward because solar has this relatively predictable daily cycle. It comes in the middle of the afternoon and it's completely zero for the entire night. The operation of storage is pretty predictable and makes a lot of sense that you store up some of your solar in the midday period, the 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. period, and then you discharge that storage at peak time, 5, 6, 7 p.m. because the solar is dropping off around then and demand is picking up. So you have this prices tend to rise around that time. So that means that your energy is the most valuable around that time. And this also makes it easier for these solar developers to sell a project to off-takers, the people that buy the electricity from a solar project. Because if you're an off-taker of electricity, you can get a lot more excited if somebody says, I have a solar power plant that will deliver power to you at peak demand rather than at noon. Good luck.
Okay, so now I'm going to use my own experiences to, add to this conversation. So I have solar. I installed solar a couple of years. I moved to Arizona, good place for solar. And just recently, the company that we had it with, they offer an on-site solar storage. It wasn't there when we first got it on, but you can pay for it. It's really cost prohibitive. But I'm just curious, how do you see the market playing out? Because I would love to get that, but I'm just not going to do it. Is it going to be the big solar plants that ultimately invest in solar storage? Or to me, it just seems like, what if they made all new homes require solar and you have the solar storage? You're almost cutting out, the energy companies. How do you see it unfolding?
Yeah, so you're sort of touching a pretty high voltage rail in the world of energy economics or electricity system economics. So you're coming upon a big debate that's raging. Mostly about distributed resources, distributed solar on a rooftop of a house or maybe on top of buildings versus centralized solar. Right. And you can ask the same question about storage. And so I'd say there's certainly a camp that says, look, it's just a lot more expensive to put solar on a rooftop than to put it out into a field. Mm-hmm. We could put a lot more solar into a solar field than we could on rooftops. We should spend our money efficiently and do community solar or do industry scale solar. And the counter argument to that is that, well, I think there's two counter arguments. One is that people like rooftop solar a lot. So, it's popular, and maybe because it's popular, it has broader adoption and potentially can lead to interest in other clean technologies like the storage that you mentioned. And then there's also a distributional benefit potentially that, if you put solar in a neighborhood, and if the peak demand in that neighborhood happens to be when solar is producing, then you have reduced the net demand in the neighborhood from solar. There's a problem if you put too much solar in a neighborhood, because then it actually wants to produce net energy back to the grid, even as a neighborhood, once you put too much of it. But storage can be a solution. And so anyway, without going too far down that rabbit hole, I guess I tend to come down more on the side of, more centralized things being most efficient. So I tend to see utilities, maybe distribution utilities, being the most logical operators or coordinators of the technology. But, again, it's popular with people. And for you, for example, it might not make strict economic sense to put storage in your house, although maybe the Public Utilities Commission will force the utility to make it worth your while. But maybe you do it anyway. Maybe you want to rely on it for backup power in case there's a power outage, or you like the idea of running your house off of your own solar power, even when it's nighttime, things like that.
Well, we have a lot of preppers in Arizona and they just want to be off the grid. And I'm not like that. So I got a couple questions here from the community room that I want to ask, but I just want to add that there's such modern technology, they give you an app with your solar. And so like every 15 minutes, it shows you what you're producing. And it just brings joy to your heart. You're just like, oh, this was a good day. And like, we've had a bunch of fires around here and you can even tell just the lingering tiny bit of smoke affects your solar. So it's just kind of fun. It's empowering to know what your energy is. So I want to jump to a couple of these questions. So from Mike, do you see flywheel technology as being something promising for storage in the future?
Yeah, so flywheels are tough. So flywheel energy storage, for people who don't know, is the idea is basically this, and it sounds a little bit silly, but it works perfectly well, that you get a big mass and you connect it to a motor, and you probably put the whole thing in a vacuum so you don't have friction. And then when you want to store energy, you just put electricity into the motor and spin up this big mass, okay? And it has this rotational momentum and it's spinning. And when you want to recover the energy, you use the motor as a generator and you recover the electricity directly from the spinning mass. And it works, and there have been flywheel storage plants that have been installed in Pennsylvania and New York and a few other places at the utility scale. But the trouble with flywheels is that they can't store much energy. They can pull the energy out of the grid very quickly, and they can deliver the energy very quickly. So they're good at what you might call ramping, but they're not very good at storing large amounts of energy. And they don't like to store it for very long. As you might imagine, if I have this big mechanical mass spinning, eventually through the friction in the system, it will wind down. So flywheels aren't good for storing energy for days or even overnight. What they have been used for successfully is what's called frequency regulation, which is basically quickly responding to the needs of the electricity grid. So before storage, grid operators would pay generators to do this thing where they get a signal every 2 seconds. So they'd say, okay, now ramp up 20%, now ramp down 10%, now ramp down 20 more percent, now ramp up 40%. And they would have to follow this power output, and they get paid to provide this service. But flywheels can, or a lot of energy storage technologies can do this. And flywheels have been installed for this purpose. Although these days, they're actually being beaten out by lithium-ion batteries that are providing the same service. So it's a tough market for flywheels these days.
All right, so another question from Hasib. Coal and oil companies worldwide are getting stimulus packages to fight pandemic-led economic crises. What about renewable energy sector?
Yeah, so that depends a lot on what country you're talking about. So the EU, I'm here in the EU, the EU stimulus packages have had a large amount of money for, they think of it more as energy transition funds, I would say, than specific green energy sources. So it includes a lot of support for things like electric vehicles, support for things like heat pumps, trying to move the economy as a whole away from fossil fuels. Obviously, in the US, the big, I guess, policy idea from the Democrats is the Green New Deal. And so there's shades of that Green New Deal that are proposed in a lot of packages by the Democrats. Obviously, that is somewhat challenging politically in US politics these days, but depending upon what happens in November in the elections, you might see a very different set of policies and spending, and especially around energy and climate from the United States.
All right. So when I think of energy and the technology to actually try to get to a carbon-free future, I mean, the technology is there. And when you hear like solar, wind, it's about using, it in the right times, the right places. And the process of moving energy around is people don't appreciate how complex that can be. And so if we truly had a strategic renewable energy policy, like, well, solar is being produced during the day in the US, but if we had, tidal energy, and I know they're still working on, but it's proven technology, if you were doing it at scale, all these things would be integrated. And in theory, you would hopefully be able to provide renewable energy 24 hours a day, right? It's just, we don't have that sort of strategic thinking, and there must be some think tanks or people like you are sort of saying, well, this is how we could accomplish that.
Yeah, well, you can definitely do that kind of thing through a centrally planned electricity system, and you can be successful. And some places are going that way. If we're thinking about the U.S. and even the EU electricity markets are very robust. They're very what we call liberalized. So some people here say that the U.S. markets are actually more protected and controlled than the European markets. But you can in theory achieve that as long as you have strict policy goals. For example, meeting an increasing percent of your electricity from zero carbon sources. As long as you have policy goals that are going to credibly be enforced, right? So they can't just be an aspirational goal. Wouldn't it be great if we could hit 100% clean energy? But if we don't, no problem. You need policies that will, make sure that you hit those goals, or the responsible parties will, have to pay significant penalties in one form or another. So, the electricity markets actually are pretty effective at delivering this type of transition if you motivate them properly. So I don't know that you strictly need to have a centrally planned transition, but you need a policy that with teeth, that people in the electricity market say, I believe in this, and I, as a purchaser, am going to plan to purchase clean electricity because I know I'm going to need it. And that investors, Wall Street looks at the policy and says, I believe that this policy is real, and we're going to need a huge amount of investment in clean energy because the purchasers are going to be there, and I want to put my money into clean energy. And when you have a strong policy, you can get all those pieces working together, even through a relatively liberalized market.
Like, I think there's a standardized term though, like it's like an MRED or something, a mandatory renewable energy target. Is that, they're still using that terminology? That could be kind of old.
There's all sorts of different ways to come at this. There's renewable energy targets, renewable portfolio standards at the state level are a strong policy in the U.S. over the past 10 or 15 years. So a decent amount of wind and solar in the US that's gotten put in place has been because states said, we want to produce this much renewable electricity by this year. And those are going forward into the future. I would say, there's other policies. There's things like carbon taxes and cap and trade. I would say that those are very effective. I would also say they're very unpopular and hard to pass. And one kind of compromise idea that has come around recently that seems to have some consensus at the national level is what I might call it, zero carbon energy targets. So the idea that you say by the year 2030, we want to get 40% of our electricity from zero carbon sources. By the year 2050, it should be 100%. And that kind of policy still allows the market to do its thing, but if you enforce it, it shows a clear goal. It shows a goal that we want to achieve, and it lets the market figure out the mechanisms. Is that all wind and solar? Is that fossil fuels with carbon capture and sequestration? Is it nuclear power? Is it a lot of storage? Whatever is in there, we let the experts in the electricity system figure it out.
Okay, so this time has sort of flown by. I really didn't get to a lot of my questions. And so we do need to wrap this up, but just what's next for you? What are you going to work on? I guess, when are you going to try to come back stateside, if ever now?
Yeah, so the plan is to come back to the U.S. in December, around the end of the year. I I have the option to extend, so I'm kind of keeping my eye on some of the COVID-19 outbreak things. But yeah, what's the future? Well, I mean, a lot of what we're working on now is trying to understand the near term, the next 10 or 20 years of decarbonization. So there's definitely a lot of people that are thinking out about the distant future. What does the grid look like 30, 40, 50 years from now? How do we get to zero carbon? And I sort of have a more short-term perspective. Like, I want to know what are we going to do today, right? And how are we going to reduce emissions next year and in the next 5 years? I guess I kind of come at things from a pessimistic point of view, not because I'm naturally a pessimist, but from my point of view of the whole energy transition is, if things turn out to be easier than we thought, then who cares? Everything's easy, it's no problem. But if there's potential problems, I want to be the person who's standing there kind of spotting them and trying to figure out how we can grapple with them well before they show up. So a lot of what we work on it sounds really pessimistic. We look at potential future scenarios, figure out what kind of things could go wrong in the interaction between technology and markets and policy, and sort of point fingers and say, look, this is a real problem that people should be paying attention to. And we propose some solutions, and a lot of other smart people figure out better solutions oftentimes. But this is sort of my place in the ecosystem of energy transition, I'd say.
Okay, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I think there's a lot more topics I think we've talked to you about, hopefully coming on again, maybe digging into some case studies and stuff, looking at Simpatico as a platform to have these conversations. I want to transition us into this just chatting, which is when the episode's officially over. But Eric, this has been great. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always good to talk about one of my favorite topics.
All right, so hold on. We'll be right back.